10% of the world's HIV-infected population, and all 3 licenses were granted to Indian companies. Now, explain the logic to me of that. Doesn't make much sense. So we need technology partnerships, not only at an institutional level, but company to company, country to country. We need that as well. And with technology transfers come know-how transfers. Because no use saying, look, we'll just transfer the technology. You know, the know-how's not there, and it takes you forever to get this over the line. Number 2, we need the institutions, the international institutions that are responsible for procurement to start procuring medicines and vaccines from Africa. So here I'm referencing the Gavies, the UNICEF in particular, the UNICEFs. I'm referencing PEPFAR, although I must commend PEPFAR. PEPFAR have taken a tremendous leap of faith, and they've said that they will be procuring offtakes from African companies for Africa of antiretrovirals. And that's the type of action we want to see, and the type of action we need to continue seeing. We need the reform from Global Fund. We need the reform from UNITAID. UNITAID have recently put out a statement to this effect as well. So let's commend them. But there's a long road to travel still. 2 markets. There's your institutional market, which is your international procurement agencies, and then you've got the governments that procure, which takes me to my 3rd point. My 3rd point is Africa in itself needs to develop pooled procurement. And that is in the context, again, of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, where we aggregate volumes. Part of why we could not access vaccines during COVID is because 54 different countries went with very little leverage and tried to, against these monolithic countries that had GDPs 30, 40 times the size, they went as sort of cap in hand and said, please give us vaccines. Different if we start aggregating our volumes and we set up a pooled procurement mechanism. But we need to stop talking about it and start doing it, because we've been talking about pooled procurement for some time as well. The last issue, because many of you in this room are regulators, we need to have regulatory frameworks that are supportive of local manufacturing, domestic manufacturing, and regional manufacturing. And that's both at a domestic level and at an international level. Now, what do I mean by that exactly? To sell a vaccine produced in South Africa, for example, to, I'm going to pick any country, Burundi, for example. Okay. What needs to happen? First of all, there's a technology transfer, 12 to 18 months. So let's say 12 months. Then the next step is your own regulator in South Africa has to approve you, which is SAPHRA. Okay, now SAPHRA have just released and I must commend them, they've just released a draft localization policy. So a priority review for locally produced products. So previously it might have taken 18 months. It's still a detail that we're grappling with. It's a draft document, but I think Dion will be introduced, I think, in January next year, or there or thereabouts, so H1 next year. That will make a massive difference. And then the 3rd step is once SAPHRA, in our case here in South Africa, approves us, the next step is WHO pre-qualification. But these are not, these are iterative steps, they're incremental steps. So you can't do all 3 steps at once. You have to do step 1, finish. Step 2, finish. Step 3, finish. Okay. And then there might even be a step 4. So when WHO PQ pre-qualifies you in 9 out of the African countries, you still have to go and get your product registered in those countries because PQ is not acceptable in those countries. So, ladies and gentlemen, by the time you go through that continuum, it could be 5 or 6 years if you work out the number, you work out the timelines I just gave you. Now, what do you think is going to happen in 5 to 6 years? Our Asian competitors who are not about to give up a 1.4 billion population market they would have long ago been in the market. They would be getting economies of scale, and economies of scale are ultimately what gives you sustainable demand. So this is why we've been agitating as an industry to have priority reviews for locally produced products. This is why we are agitating, even today as we stand here, for WHO to consider both a priority review and parallel submission at the same time. We do this elsewhere. There's no good reason or cause why we cannot have parallel rolling submissions with WHO as well. It's going to require SAPHRA working with WHO, but until and unless we achieve these 4 points, then the project is going to fail. The next pandemic will come around, and I think we've been pretty fortunate so far with Mpox and long may it hold, but we are starting to see more ominous glades like the glade that's emerged in DR Congo, where we are starting to see high mortality rates. So in conclusion, to move backwards into producing drug substance, we first need to sort out the drug product aspect. So the formulation, fill and finish in the case of vaccines, formulation in the case of therapeutics. If we don't do that, we're looking at how do we even backwardly integrate further, because that is even more complex and requires more capex. You need these big reactors and all the rest of it. So in conclusion, we've got to execute on this 4-point plan. There's no reason why we shouldn't. There's lots of dragging of heels. There's lots of talk and very little action often. And hopefully every single one of us in this room, Godfrey, led by yourself, can become ambassadors and activists for local production through the execution of these 4 points. Anything short will be considered failure. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nicolaou. Colleagues, we will take questions at the end of all our speakers having spoken. But just to reflect quickly on what Stavros mentions in terms of the 4-point plan. Something he makes mention of is that we need technology transfers to facilitate local production of pharmaceuticals in Africa. And that will make for quite a meaningful conversation, because we have, as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Gore, who's joining us from Geneva, who is heading up the medicines patent pool that deals primarily with issues of technology transfers. And we will just wish to have that unpacked in the context of their strategy 2023 to 2025. How can Africa and low middle income countries be favorably considered in the context of their strategy? So without saying anything further, I would like to welcome Mem Lobsa. She's from African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, otherwise known as AVMI. She's going to talk to us about the objectives and the goals of AVMI. If we can please give a warm welcome. Gentlemen, if you can flight a presentation, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm very, very impressed that you could come and join us after a lamb-shank lunch. So thank you very much. I will use my 10 minutes wisely. Let me just take that. So just from an AVMI perspective, my good friend Tumi, as program director, asked me to come and talk a little bit about the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, the objectives and why it's really relevant right now. And I think there is no better time, right? As we heard this morning, let us not waste the pandemic. And also, I echo everything that my colleague Stavros said, that we keep asking, we keep talking, but has there been much action? I do, however, want to change tack a little bit and tell you that there has been some action. And so what it needs from us now is to really leverage this opportunity that we're seeing. So maybe I can, do you know where the presentation's gone? So maybe I can just start by saying the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative is an organization that represents 20 current and aspiring vaccine manufacturers on the continent. It is really critical that at this point in time, we leverage the momentum of everything that has been happening to really give industry a voice. And so with all the engagements that we're seeing and we're hearing, I'm assuming that the green button moves it. Okay, the left. So maybe just next slide, please. So really from everything that's happened so far post-pandemic, there has been some ecosystem change. And I just wanted to stop a little bit to tell you what is happening right now, what progress has been made, and based of this progress, what is the role of ADMI, what are our strategic objectives, and what are we really busy with right now. So from the perspective of what you would have heard a little bit this morning with Abebe, if you were in the opening sessions, there really has been this coordination from the African Union mandated and collectively, I'm very loud, but I'll try, okay, not to pull together and to collectively really analyze the market, come up with what is the current landscape, what is it looking like, how many manufacturers do we have, engage the manufacturers. And this PAVM, which was the Partnerships for African Vaccine Manufacturing, has in February been mandated to expand beyond vaccines to therapeutics and diagnostics as well. So what we're looking at is a continental look at what's happening on the continent from a health perspective, and that is the coordination mechanism, which if you will recall, pre-pandemic, there really wasn't much visibility of which manufacturers, what are they doing, what is their status, what is their regulatory status in their NRA. So I think from the coordination perspective, that's a big tick, and that is in place. What we just saw in June was the culmination of probably 18 months of work with Gavi and huge donors who support Gavi to create a fund of 1.2 billion to support African vaccine manufacturing. This was launched in June in Paris, co-hosted by France and the Africa CDC and Gavi. And this 1.2 billion, I'll talk to you a little bit more on the next slide because it's very, very important to understand what this funding mechanism is and how it will support African manufacturers. But importantly, what still needs to be done to allow manufacturers to even access these funds. So that's a big one in terms of financial mechanism. And then the last one is the one that Stav alluded to a little bit earlier, is the procurement. How do we move from country by country procuring 55 member states to unlocking that continental demand, to giving vaccine manufacturers and indeed healthcare manufacturers access to this continental market, which would then drive volumes. The volumes would drive efficiencies, economies of scale, and ultimately would result in more competitive costs of vaccines, right? A facility that has a throughput of only their own country's demand is not able to compete with current incumbent vaccine manufacturers based largely in India at this point in time. But once we unlock continental demand, we would have a chance to compete. And between now and then, we've got this financial mechanism that would hopefully support us to reduce our cost of manufacture. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to take a minute to just talk to you quickly about this. You would have seen this morning, hopefully, but it's critical. It is a critical slide because what it shows is that coordination that I spoke to in the first bucket. What it is Africa CDC mandating a piece of work by asking CHAI and PATH to go throughout the continent and visit each one of the manufacturers, physically visit them, assess their facilities, understand their tech transfers. Do they have agreements in place? Have they built facilities yet? Do they plan to build facilities? Do they have funding? Do they have current tech transfers, or are they only planning for tech transfers? What experience do they have? And on the basis of all that physical site visits, they came up with this list
of 8 antigens that are expected to come from African manufacturers between 2025 and 2030 for sale to UNICEF and other African member states. So in the 5-year period, 25 to 2030, it's no longer uncertain. It's very clear where are these vaccines coming from, what are they, and if you'll see the darker green, it talks to end to end. So this is where it's not just full finish, it is drug substance, right? So we're doing the actual drug substance on the continent as well as full finish. So this is critical because it talks to the point in the beginning. Post-pandemic, we didn't really know what we have on the continent, who's coming, what are they coming with. Here we have a clear plan. Next slide, please. And then, as I said earlier, this financial mechanism, the second block, the second bubble where I said financial coordination. This is AVMA. This is the African Vaccine Manufacturers Accelerator launched in June. The Gavi Fund, where donors have now contributed 1.2 billion towards vaccine manufacturing. But here's the key. It's only between 2024 and 2034. So what needs to happen for an African manufacturer to access these funds? Quite a lot, considering that it's only applicable to Gavi vaccines that are procured, which means they have to be WHO pre-qualified. As Stavros said earlier, what is our pathway to WHO pre-qualification? Are there manufacturers in Africa who know the full processes of WHO, who know what to do, who know how to access this? This is the work that industry is looking to do to try and unpack this for manufacturers so that they can access the likes of AVMA. But AVMA is only a medium-term tool, right? It's going to reduce your cost of manufacture. In the short term, the only way this is sustainable is to the point made earlier, where our governments commit to procure and unlock this continental 1.2, 1.4 billion doses per annum. Right? That's the only way that this becomes sustainable. But from now till then, hopefully AVMA can support manufacturers who are making these vaccines with payments that would help them reduce their cost of manufacture, so we can still compete with the likes of the current incumbents. If you go to the next slide, then I think we get to the crux of the matter, which is what I was asked. What is the role of AVMI? And so you'll see that it's important that you understand the context to see what we're doing, why we're doing it, and why it's so important that you all become advocates for AVMI, advocates for vaccine manufacturers, indeed advocates for local manufacturing and regional manufacturing. So from the perspective of what are we doing, we are the voice of industry. When we spoke of the AVMA, the Gavi AVMA that was launched in June, we played a key role in trying to get those incentives to be higher, in trying to get the incentives to cover bigger portfolios of vaccines, in trying to match the vaccines of the incentives to the vaccines of Africa CDC, which are priority vaccines for our continent, right? Not just priorities for everywhere else. So voice of industry, we're working with the African Union, with Africa CDC. We meet with them monthly to understand what the progress is on the pooled procurement mechanism, where we can unlock this continental demand. Stavros tells me every week or every second week it's not happening fast enough, but of course that I agree with. It still is important to continue to focus on this PPM because, as we said earlier, demand and volume guarantee, certainty of demand is the only way these facilities become sustainable in the longer term. We are working with the regulatory team, so we have met with the WHO Pre-Qualification Unit. I do see that WHO is here today. Hi, Deuce. We've met with the WHO Pre-Qualification team to come down, and they've agreed without any much asking. In fact, I offered, could we do this workshop in, Copenhagen or somewhere where we're going for a global meet next month? And they offered, please let us do it in Africa because it is about African manufacturers. So this meeting is happening in October. So there's a lot happening. And what's the point of the meeting? The point is, let's discuss with African manufacturers, where are they? How far are they? What do they need? Do they know what they need to do? To Stavros' point earlier, once you have pre-qualification, there are still countries who require to submit a full dossier for local NRA approval. How do we get around the table and work through this and accelerate our progress and our ability to get to market? So we want to be the voice of industry. We are the voice of industry. We need to create an enabling ecosystem and environment through regulatory, through procurement reform, so that we can get these manufacturers to access the market. And ultimately, we need to support sustainable vaccine manufacturing. So if we go to my last slide then, second last, but I'll combine it. So basically, when you get into the detail of this, right, I don't think we should just be talking big big words anymore. We are far past the time to just be saying we need demand. We need to understand, what does that mean? When we talk about unlocking continental demand, it means asking a member state, asking South Africa to buy from Ghana. When the tax revenues don't go, it's South Africa to buy from Ghana. What makes that local? How do we have conversations with each member state, understand their sovereignty, their plans for their own vaccine manufacturing, their plans for their own expanded vaccine or health manufacturing, and how do we fit that into them supporting the continental agenda and the continental ask? What funding would they need to buy from a manufacturer down the road in the continent versus buying it from India? How do we support them? How do we work with Africa CDC to support each member state to choose, not only to choose local, but to insist on local? Because the fact is, when they procure from UNICEF, they can choose, they can say, I prefer a locally manufactured vaccine if it is available and pre-qualified, right? So we need to get that piece. In terms of regulatory, I've discussed that, Stavros mentioned it earlier again, it's about WHO pre-qualification. It's about how do we get as quickly as possible, but also understanding that there are existing frameworks and processes and how do we work within those to accelerate the timelines. And then the last piece is really, really critical. I've spent a couple of panels talking just about innovative funding, right? We need to get funding that is not just about giving us loans. Everywhere you go, you open the paper, you listen to somebody speak, there's lots of billions available, but manufacturers aren't really able to tap into that easily. And so that's another role that we as ALMI are doing, to look at instruments that are really innovative and go end to end. Supporting research and development on the continent is critical. I'll end with this last piece where we say, until the continent owns its own assets, we will continue the cycle of dependency. And so I'll ask you again to all be advocates for vaccine manufacturing on the continent. As we heard earlier this morning, it is not a nice to have, it is a must have. And when you do have it, you actually have a thriving ecosystem. You've created jobs, you've created skills, and it's just a win-win all around. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. I think we can pick up that at this stage, there are emerging themes. The most glaring ones are, first, that you need to use procurement as a lever to grow local industries. And the second one relates to regulatory, that we need to get ourselves to a point where the WHO is able to confer pre-qualification status on our manufacturers. So there's quite a bit of work there, obviously, to be done by SAPHRA, but it is well on its way there, I believe, in terms of maturity levels. Let me just take this opportunity to welcome the folks from the WHO. I had not taken note of them. You are welcome. Thank you so much. Okay, coming up next is Dr. Karen Nell. She's from Design Biologics. She's going to chat to us about another aspect of vaccine manufacturing, the veterinary side. Thank you so much, and please welcome her.
Tabo. Okay, I am a biochemist by training. My company's name is Design Biologics. We are animal vaccine manufacturers. The lamb shank that you ate was probably vaccinated with one of our vaccines. See, okay, I want to start off my talk with just a video of some of our facilities. Tabo, if you, no, I don't see Tabo. It's just a brag video of a new facility that we're busy refurbishing. There is sound as well, so okay.
Our mission is to design and manufacture innovative solutions that support the animal's health and the farmer's business. We achieve this with a skilled team of passionate, curious, dedicated people who work to the highest standards in the design, realization, and manufacturing processes. Our vision is to be one of the world's forward-thinking leaders in animal healthcare, to empower veterinarians and farmers to protect the animals with the best solutions from snout to tail.
Okay, just a brief history of our company. We have been manufacturing or developing, manufacturing, registering, marketing and distributing animal vaccines since 1994. So this is our 30th year of manufacture. We've also very recently added a training component to our offering where we go out to farmer days, to feedlot days, to rural farmer days and so on and train them on the use of vaccines, on the importance of vaccines, on good animal health and so on. The sound is coming and going. Does it sound okay to all of you? Okay. All right. So we specialize in commercial vaccines and then what is known as autogenous vaccines, which are farm-specific, designed for a specific farm, sometimes specific animals. So we do the whole lot there. We do our own research. We have an R&D team that looks at potential new diseases. We liaise a lot with the veterinary and pathology industry to see what is coming out of animals and then try and develop products that are relevant to the diseases. We're in the process of becoming GMP compliant, which is quite a mission on its own. For this reason, we bought the new facility, most of which you saw on the video, and we have a GMP consultant. We also routinely have EU audits from some of the multinationals for whom we manufacture products. We manufacture about between 20 and 30 million doses, or actually sell between 20 and 30 million doses of our products per annum. And we have 14 products that are registered with Ad36, which is our regulatory body, like 101 is yours. And then we, as I say, we export some of our products to Europe. Okay. So I thought I'd start off by, I'd spend a bit of time explaining what I see as the similarities between our two industries and then the differences. Because from what I've been hearing spoken today, there are very big differences between the two industries. So similarly, we work in a very regulated environment, as you do. 101 is strict, Act 36 is strict. We have long lead times for registration. It's a big challenge. It can take as long as 8 years to get a product registered, which is very frustrating for farmers, feedlots, and so on, because when the disease is there, they need it to be sorted out. You all know as well, with the high prevalence of antimicrobial resistance, antibiotics are not the preferred option anymore. And in any case, they don't work for viral diseases. Okay, GMP requirements. I highlight that because unlike your industry, in our industry, price margins are crucial. So GMP for us costs the same as GMP for anybody else, except we can't pass that on to our end users. There's a high resistance level to price increases in the farmers, and they would rather not vaccinate than spend 15 Rand on a vaccine dose. So we're very, very sensitive to that. So it makes implementing something like GMP a very, very big challenge. Then something that I think you've all experienced as well, the financial implications of the extremely long lead times of raw materials that the whole world is experiencing now, which means that you have to increase the level of minimum stock levels of raw materials, which is dead capital sitting on your shelf. Okay, differences. We manufacture from start to finish. So in other words, we manufacture the bulk antigens, we formulate them, we fill, and we go all the way, label and pack, go all the way through to distribution. We perform most of our QC tests in-house. We do everything in-house. I think our dossiers are a bit simpler in terms of what is required, and we can achieve the target animal efficacy testing far quicker than you can. There's not that big a resistance in the animal field to testing vaccines. And I think we also have a broader capability for innovation. We have quite a few adjuvants, for instance, that are available for us to use. I think in the human industry, if I'm correct, aluminum hydroxide is still almost the only one that's acceptable. So we can innovate, we can do interesting combinations of diseases, because the other thing is, on a farm or in a feedlot, one needle is better than 10. So if you can combine 5 or 6 different antigens into one shot, that's first prize. And they must all work. Okay, and I just want to highlight some of the challenges that we face. Obviously, our industry has many more species than yours does. So, and each of them has their own special brand of diseases. The enormous cost of GMP implementation, as I've explained. And then a lack of understanding of the regulators, and this is not meant as a criticism, but there's a lack of understanding in the regulators about the difference between a pharmaceutical active and a vaccine antigen. As soon as they ask you what's your active, you can know this is going to be a problem. You're going to have to do some explaining, because there is no active in a vaccine. It's a whole bacterium or a whole virus or a whole protein. You can't measure it. You can measure it indirectly maybe, but you can't run it through an HPLC column and quantify it and so on. You also can't test necessarily for any extraneous substances that might be there. So that makes evaluation of our dossiers a bit of a challenge. Load shedding has placed an enormous burden on the retailers that sell our products. That would be the co-ops and so on. They don't even want to stock our products anymore because they can't maintain the cold chain because of the generators and. So that means that we ship out 1 vial to a farmer or 2 vials to Meerkop somewhere. Then again, the margins, just what I mentioned previously, we have very small margins that we can apply. So it again makes manufacturing a bit of a challenge. It's fun, but it is a bit of a challenge. Then we are required to acquire permits for any field trials that we want to do. So even if you're going to evaluate an inactivated vaccine, you still have to get a permit from Section 20 indicating where you're going to be using it, what you're going to be doing. If you want to draw blood from animals, you need a permit to do that. If you want to transport the blood, you need a permit to do that. So it makes life interesting, and it can take very long to get these permits. We've on occasion waited 2 years for permission to just draw blood from animals. And then the long lead times for product registration, which is similar to yours. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karen. Yeah, absolutely. Colleagues, thank you very much, Dr. Nell. I think what we can see the picture is in terms of our esteemed panel, we've got one organization that is for advocacy. We've got 2 organizations that manufactures vaccines, one for humans and the other for animals. So what we're going to hear next is a quasi-UN organization that is mandated to provide some of the solutions to the challenges that have been articulated by both the advocacy group and the manufacturers. So please, let's welcome Mr. Gore, Charles Gore, joining us virtually. He's going to talk to us about the activities of the Medicines Patent Pool.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me and this opportunity to talk about what the Medicines Patent Pool is trying to do for low and middle income countries, but for Africa in particular, around strengthening regional production. So one of the things that is perfectly clear is outbreaks and pandemics come along. They will continue to come along, new diseases, re-emergence of old ones over time. And the fact that we know all this does not mean that we're prepared for it. And preparedness requires a great deal of action. But I'm not going to talk just about preparedness for pandemics, because apart from anything else, industrialization and health security in Africa is about interpandemic times just as much as pandemic times. So the Medicines Patent Pool was set up in 2010 by UNITAID, which is a UN organization housed within the World Health Organization, in order to try and get access to affordable HIV medicines. And over time, we have expanded because that proved to be very successful. And our model is that we go to originator companies who have patented new vaccines or therapeutics and say to them, look, you are not selling anything in Africa at the moment, or indeed in most low and middle income countries. Please give us a license. We can then sub-license that to manufacturers in low and middle income countries to produce high quality but affordable versions. And that way everybody wins. That's the theory. And as I say, we started out in HIV. Because that was successful, we expanded to TB and hepatitis C, and then more recently to any essential medicine that's patented. We've also been looking more recently at long-acting therapeutics, partly because UNITAID, who, as I say, established us, have been very interested in this, and it's clearly one of the key ways that medicines are heading. And indeed, we have a license for a long-acting HIV drug, which is being developed by generic manufacturers at the moment. And then during COVID, WHO asked us to partner with them to set up vaccine manufacturing in low and middle income countries where it really didn't exist, to address the obvious problems that became apparent during COVID, particularly in Africa, but not only. Historically, we have tended to concentrate on small molecule therapeutics. However, as we've expanded into vaccines, but also more complicated therapeutics, biologics have become very important, and consequently, the need for technology transfer. Whereas previously, many companies could produce their own simple small molecule without tech transfer. Now with more complicated molecules and vaccines in particular, know-how and tech transfer are absolutely vital. And the map you see there shows where we have manufacturers, and the sort of dark blue, grey, greeny color is where there are manufacturers who have licenses for therapeutics from us, but also are
Charles,
part of our...
If I can just interject there for a moment, please. Can you please put your presentation on presentation mode, the full screen mode?
I'm so sorry. Yes, that would help you.
Thank you so much.
No, my apologies. Yes, as I say, the sort of, I mean, if you look at India there, for example, all those in that color are either, they're countries that have licensees for our therapeutics, but are also part of the technology transfer vaccine program. And the purple is just those that are part of the technology transfer program, and the yellow are just licensees in those countries. And originally, when we started the mRNA tech transfer program, the idea is that we would do vaccines more generally. However, it became quickly apparent that we needed to concentrate on one platform only, hence mRNA. And as you know, that program, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail later on, is centered in South Africa, in that Afrigen are doing the actual development of the platform itself that will then be tech transferred out to another company, Biovac, in South Africa, and 14 others in 14 countries around the world. So the mechanism that we use, which, as I say, involves both patents and tech transfer often. Sometimes it's just patents, sometimes it's just tech transfer, and sometimes it's all three together. Start with, as I said, we persuade big pharmaceutical companies generally to give us licenses on their latest medicine, because clearly everybody could wait until patents expire and then generic manufacturers could come into the market. But that could be 10, 15 years later, by which point a lot of people have died from not having access to these medicines. So we want to try and get these available to people in low and middle income countries as soon as possible. And our licenses are extremely flexible and bespoke. And we negotiate them with the patent holders, depending on their needs, on the public health needs, the needs of generic manufacturers, to try and get a win-win-win for everybody. So that the patent holders get something out of it, the countries can afford to buy the products, or if it's out-of-pocket expensive, then people can afford to buy them. And then public health benefits as well. And there can be royalties. Generally, we don't have royalties in least developed countries, quite often not in lower middle income countries, more often in upper middle income countries. And then the generic companies become the patent holders. Now, just to go back for a moment to that map. Prior to COVID, Africa was a great deal more empty than it is there. It's still pretty empty, but it was very empty then. We were trying to encourage manufacturers in Africa to apply for licenses, but we were getting very few applications. And because our process depends on people applying, there wasn't a lot we could do. With COVID, we made a huge effort to expand that. And you'll see we now have a number of countries producing, which is great, but it's still not, it's not nearly enough. And so we are, for example, at the moment, in discussions with Unitaid about a program that they've just launched to increase local manufacturing in Africa. It's in quite specific areas, postpartum hemorrhage, TB and HIV. But again, it's important to start somewhere. Tech transfer is not a simple or quick process in most cases, and particularly when you start talking about biologics. So I think it's important that everyone recognizes that we have to do this, but it will take longer than we would ideally like. So switching now from the therapeutics and the biologics more towards the vaccines. So as I said, this was a program set up by WHO, which we are partnering with them. And it's all about empowering low and middle income countries, and in this case, particularly Africa, to develop the technology and then to transfer it in a multilateral way to a range of other companies. And this has honestly gone extremely well. Afrigen have developed a COVID-19 vaccine, the idea being that it was important to develop something that could be compared with existing mRNA vaccines to make sure that we have the technology working. And in animal models, that's been very successful. The animal model program will finish later this year with non-human primates. And it will then be transferred, as I said, to these other companies. But what's critically important, as I said earlier, is this cannot be just about pandemic preparedness. This also has to be about interpandemic times. There's no point equipping people with a technology and then saying, well, yeah, but you can't use it until we get the next pandemic. It's not economically viable. So what is happening further to that is the development of R&D networks, where the partners in the program are coming together to use the mRNA platform to develop vaccines against diseases of relevance to them from an economic point of view, but to their region from a public health point of view. And so already there are 4 of these consortia up and running, looking at dengue, for example, human HPV, various others. But in order to support all this, it is really important to have an ecosystem. And this is one of the reasons that tech transfer, which in itself can take quite a lot of time, as a program really takes quite a lot of time, because you need this ecosystem. You need an adequately trained workforce. You need the access to technologies, which may be through licensing and maybe through own development. You need an R&D capacity. So you need things like your national institutes of research, your some of your other things, your universities, for example, to come together in a coordinated fashion to feed into this. You need the actual infrastructure. You need the factories. As was mentioned earlier, it's very important to have not just a functioning, but a speedy regulatory system that uses a lot of reliance, so that, for example, if you are going to want to sell a product in 30 countries, you're not having to do completely different submissions to each of the regulatory authorities. And you need workforce opportunities. There's no point having a trained workforce if there are no opportunities. They will just go and work somewhere else. And very, very important, you need coherent industrial, economic, and health policies. So we heard earlier about Gavi's initiative, AVMA, which is extremely important in terms of providing funding for newly developed or newly increased vaccine manufacturing. Because typically, if you are early stage, whether it's in scale up or of your facilities, or you're starting from scratch, your costs will be higher. So if you are then competing with a very high volume established manufacturer from, say, India, you're not going to be able to compete on price without some help. And that help can either come from the kind of subsidies that Gavi are talking about, or it can come internally from governments who are saying, we are prepared to pay a little bit more because this is our own industry. Now, if you're a minister of health, you're going, no, wait a minute, I don't want to pay more. I've got a very limited budget. So what you have to do is have internal transfers of funds between the departments of industrial development or whoever it might be who are benefiting, and the ministries of health, who are the ones who are actually having to pay the cost. Where you have costs and benefits in different places, you've got to have a whole of government approach, and that is really important. And clearly, the ability of governments to buy will be critical to supporting this, any of these initiatives over the long term. And this cannot be done on a country by country basis. It's got to be done regionally. It makes no sense to have 54 countries in Africa all producing exactly the same things. There won't be the market. That means there've got to be agreements. We just heard in the last talk. You've got to have a sensible way of agreeing this. Why is Botswana going to buy something slightly more expensive, a slightly more expensive vaccine from South Africa? they've got to somehow be included. And there are all sorts of ways of doing this, whether this is through trade policies, whether this is through involving somewhere else in the supply chain, which of course is the ideal. Because let's talk vaccines for a moment. If you had countries, if you are the vaccine producer, but you have countries around you supplying a lot of the raw materials, you are not going to say, we're not going to sell to you in the face of a pandemic, because you're going to be reliant on them for the raw materials. So creating interdependence is a great way to combat nationalism when it comes to things like pandemic. So just to conclude and say, we are here very much to support this entire very ambitious and absolutely critical program of work of Africa to make sure that you have the necessary manufacturing so that you are both health secure and you have the opportunity for industrial development. And we have offered our help for tech transfer around monkeypox to the Africa CDC. We have also offered to do what we can to support the Africa Pharmaceutical Technology Foundation in terms of technology transfer. And what essentially, because we're a public health organization, and because we now have a significant amount of expertise in both licensing and tech transfer, we are really there putting it out as an offer to, in this case, Africa, to make sure that we can do what we can to help and empower you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. Charles, if I can just maybe kick off by asking one question. The issue has been somewhat recurring. From the lofty goals that the MPP is set up for, and from the experience on the ground, there appears to be a disconnect. If one takes into consideration a point that you made, that there's a low uptake from African manufacturers to apply for the programs of the MPP, what would you say the barriers are?
Okay, one of the barriers quite definitely has been the requirement for PQ, WHO PQ, or approval by another stringent regulatory authority. It is felt that the cost of doing that, so say you have a manufacturer who is currently manufacturing just for its local market, and they think, well, yes, we could go and get a license for MPP. That would mean we'd have many more markets to sell in, but is it worth the investment? Or, in the case of Africa, could we even get the investment? You know, as we're all aware, the cost of funds in Africa is very high. So I think that has been a major problem. I think there's been maybe a failure to understand exactly what our model involves, and people think that it's more complicated than it is applying through us. And also we do give support in terms of development. And also I think that, you know, a number of companies are not necessarily at a sufficiently advanced level. So as an example, during COVID, we had a license for Merck's molnupiravir, and we gave a license to a manufacturer in Africa, which is great. Then we got a license for Pfizer's Paxlovid, and we went to the same company and said, would you like a license for this? And they said, no, sorry, that molecule's a bit too complex for us at the moment. So, you know, a lot of it is just getting the experience of doing more and more complex things. And clearly, if we move into biologics, that's a whole nother area. I mean, you know, for example, you know, we'd all love to see Mpox vaccine manufacturing in Africa at the moment. But it's actually a very complex vaccine to produce and requiring high levels of biosafety, and is not something that can be done overnight. So I think it's a mixture of perhaps a bit of lack of knowledge, worries about the financial investment, and a lack of capability.
Okay.
But the important thing is we start and we move along the chain to more and more complex things. And we have this wonderful window of opportunity. It's about seizing it now.
No, thanks, Charles. I'm sure there'll be more questions. Thanks for that. Colleagues, can we have a first round of questions, please? Do identify yourself kindly. And if your question is directed at a specific speaker, please do say which speaker that is. So we'll recognize hands. There's one hand over there.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the great presentation and all the steps that have been indicated with regards to local manufacturing. I think my question will go to design biologics, right? Thank you so much for that. I think my interest is on your platform for the GMP setup manufacturing capability that you've put up in your company. I would like to know if there is an opportunity for you to support startups that are working on vaccine manufacturing for animals that have a need for capacity building with regards to the required manufacturing at an upscaled level for the required vaccine. I don't know if I'm clear, just the demand for upskilled manufacturing for startups. So startups that are ready to manufacture at a higher scale. So essential requirements on the GMP and other requirements. I just want to know your interest in supporting the startups in that version. Thanks.
Thank you very much. There's another question over there.
Thank you. My name is Stavros Nicolaou from the CSIR in Pretoria. And so I like the idea of reverse integration, backward integration, and technology transfer as a strategy to advance local manufacturing. But because I've heard a few speakers earlier talk about a strong university and R&D ecosystem, is it possible that forward integration from R&D to manufacturing is a strategy we should pursue?
And to whom will the question go to, Dr. Tseko? All right.
Okay. Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentation. My question goes to the medicinal patent pool. I'm coming from ICGB in Trieste, Italy, Biotechnology Development Unit, and we are doing technology transfers as well. So my question is like this non-exclusive licensing and technology transfer of biotherapeutics. So what they actually mean? Do they involve also the training of personnel? Because as you said, it's a complicated process. We are talking about biologics. We are talking about lack of skills. So do they involve anyhow training of actual personnel and actual hands-on training? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. There's another one, and then we'll close with the gentleman there at the back.
Hi, good day. Professor Naidu from Inoko Lab Solutions. Charles mentioned the difficulties in encapsulating certain biological components. I was wondering if the panel would want to elaborate on some of these difficulties and in relation to scaling up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Last question over there. Scale.
He was able to receive a patent. A company in South Africa that he worked with said that it was too complicated, too complex. Is the complexity the encapsulation technology? Was it difficult to encapsulate? Where did the complexity come from?
Okay, I don't think it was necessarily encapsulation as in a dosage form, but the technology itself in terms of its manufacture and various aspects, and it was I think he said broadly African or South African necessarily.
Okay,
Yes.
was
But I think the question is to the panel, right?
no,
If I
it was
understood.
to Charles.
Or is it to Charles? Okay. So we'll take the last question for this current round of questions, and then the next one.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to all the panelists for a very engaging set of talks today. I'm Matt Clayton from Thermo Fisher Scientific. My first question is to Stavros and Farah, specifically on when it comes to working within the tech transfer space. You highlighted it as part of your 4-step plan, Stavros. So when it comes to working within tech transfers, do you see that bringing any benefit to the regulatory timeline length that you highlighted as being part of the problem? That's the first question. And the second question is to all three. Is there any way that we could look as suppliers, and I don't just mean Thermo Fisher Scientific, there are other suppliers here today as well, we could all benefit from a bit more engagement on how we could more proactively support pooled procurement for Africa in general? Is there anything that you three could specifically highlight to the suppliers where we could play a better role in making that a sort of more accelerated timeline? Thank you.
Sorry, if I can just ask again, from which organization are you from? Okay, thank you. Yes, please go for it.
I'll go first so that Stav can answer all the difficult ones afterwards. Just firstly on the question of R&D and upstream, etc. I think it's a great question. I think we tend to spend too much time talking about full finish because it's our first route to market. Remember, this is long lead time to do a tech transfer just of a full finish is a long lead time to get the regulatory approvals. The whole process is quite a number of years. When you add on development, it's even longer. And when you start looking from the front end, traditionally how this happens is companies invest huge amounts of money at very high risk for development. What South Africa specifically has in terms of ecosystem is researchers. We've got the universities, we've got the research, CSIR, etc. What we don't have is that innovative funding that I spoke up at front, right? It's that ability to spend a lot of money in developing, which you see in the big global pharma companies. So what we do, in fact, those companies spend up to 12% plus on R&D, right? So this is what we're missing in this term, in terms of the ecosystem in South Africa. But it doesn't mean that we're leaving it there. My company in terms of BioVac, so I also represent from manufacturing perspective BioVac, and we work because we're also doing a project that's end-to-end in terms of oral cholera. So we are working with the researchers, we're working with the universities, CSIR, etc., to develop a training academy and a hub that can then leverage and pull all these bits together from the ecosystem towards ultimately having development in South Africa and on the continent. But it is a long way away, and it requires funding, and it requires at-risk funding. So that's on that question. Then I will hand over to you. I just want to say, in terms of Charles does have the question about the Paxlovid, was it question, right? And the South African manufacturer saying it is very important also, and I think that's probably a good cue to AVMI from an industry perspective to also do a better job of just knowledge sharing about the complexity of the different technological platforms, how you need to be able to have capabilities in certain platforms to be able to leverage it onto other vaccines, etc., that suit that platform. Otherwise, you can leverage some of the learnings, but it's an entirely new platform. So, for example, when you do get a license for something, it depends on your platform, whether your speciality, what your tech capability is, whether you would have to invest further for you to make a decision whether you can, do one license in addition to another. And then the big part of this is where's the demand, right? Because these companies are spending a lot of money to be able to do these technology transfers, and we are doing it sometimes at huge risk because we don't have this secure demand, which brings us right back full circle to what we said at the beginning. Everything starts and ends with secure demand. And within the continent, we have the demand, we have the patients. We just need to keep our demand within the continent and not send it all over the borders.
Thanks very much. I think Faraz covered most of the issues. So let me just very broadly cover a few thematics. I think the first one is that we shouldn't underestimate some of the capabilities and capacities that exist on the African continent. By way of example, my company Aspen is the single largest supplier of general anesthetics. So these are globally, I'm talking globally, these are complex products to manufacture. As you know, they products like propofol, for example. So we shouldn't underestimate that. I think what African companies are hesitant about is that until and unless there is demand and procurement, you become very risk averse, because we've seen so many times tech transfers or promises to tech transfer, or that we'll procure from Africa, and then no production happens, and no orders are placed, and then what? So the first reform that needs to happen, and many of the sins get forgiven if you have this sustainable demand and a reform of both domestic and global procurement from Africa for Africa. And I think that's what we often forget. Now, the second thing is, we should also look at a one-size-fits model. A one-size-fits-all model doesn't work for Africa. Africa's got certain limitations. Like I said earlier, we don't yet have R&D capability. So we are dependent on tech transfers. But in being dependent on tech transfers, you have to customize or tailor the type of tech transfer conversation you have with Africa, as you do with the regulators, with WHO PQ. It's got to be a customized, more nuanced type of discussion. Because at the end of the day, the numbers never lie. I keep saying this. And people say, but we're putting so much effort into Africa. It's not the effort, it's the end result that counts here. And let me give you some of the stats, which are quite, they're quite alarming, and they're quite, in a sense, deafening as well. So the first is, despite all these efforts, Africa's pharmaceutical trade deficit grows year on year. And that's even with a country like Egypt, who is now producing 91% by volume of what they can produce locally, they're producing. So even within Egypt, the trade deficit keeps growing year on year. The second thing is, if we have a look at the procurement from international procurement agencies on African products, again, the deficit keeps growing. So those are just two statistics that prove the point. So what's the final message I want to leave you with? The final message is that we need to listen and hear Africa as to what are the solutions that work for Africa, from Africa, not things that get transposed onto the continent from elsewhere. And that's why you have this gap in understanding, where it's, well, we don't think we can make it here. That's not the point. We need to sit down and have African nuanced solutions if we are to bridge all these gaps and deficits and get to health security of the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thermo Fisher's question quickly. There was just one question on the supply chain and the end-to-end. Yes, absolutely. Critical part of the ecosystem. We need to be able to see increased agility in lead times and pricing structures, because I think once you get this support across the continent in terms of the PAHAM, which is now vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, Africa CDC will coordinate in terms of supply chain. So there's definitely an opportunity, agility, lead times, pricing. Thanks.
Okay, there was a question for Dr. Nell about startups and GMP.
Okay, so if we look at developing products or products that are in development, the very, very first question we ask before we go any further is, can it be scaled up? If it can't be scaled up, we don't even touch it. So if we don't see any potential for scale up, we won't look at it. Other than that, we will happily entertain any possible vaccine for the animal market. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Okay, colleagues, we're flatly out of time. Is there any one burning question? One. Okay. All right. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our esteemed speakers, and Charles also joining us from Geneva. Thank you very much for your time. And one last remark from my end is these discussions, certainly Stavros has been part of them for decades, and they are not new. So one way or the other, we need to make breakthrough. And let's embrace the strategy that is being presented to the minister today and see how we can operationalize it and bring some solutions to the long-standing problems that we've had. I also wish to thank you as the audience for joining this session. Thank you so much. Take care.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm sure you must be very tired of infectious diseases by now. Pandemics, epidemics, antivirals, this and that, vaccines. The good news is that this session tries to veer away from that and introduces the other burden. I read an article on the weekend, on Friday, that South Africa now has more people suffering from diabetes, chronic sufferers on chronic medication than infectious diseases. It doesn't mean that the rate of infections is higher or lower. It just means that people that are on treatment for diabetes and other chronic diseases is now higher for the first time across the threshold. And it's something that is Stavros last year, he did mention it in the session that was at this time, that from Aspen's perspective, they're seeing an upswing in the demand for drugs for non-infectious diseases or non-communicables. So it's likely that you guys are in the vanguard of this important discussion that is going to become increasingly, and I think earlier today we heard from Lawrence Banks, the devastation that HPV risks with cervical cancer. So the session now tries to provide a framework to look at non-communicables. Part of what we do in Africa Bio is to provide a platform for advocacy, to move things that are under the radar to a point where they become part of the everyday agenda, policy agenda and the like. And I'm glad that I'm joined in this discussion today by individuals that are doing something to change the cause and the dialogue that is currently happening, the narrative. We will have 3 presentations. It will be the first one, and